Well, hello. We haven't been through a time like this before, not in my lifetime nor in yours. In fact, it could be argued that no one has. So I've been spending a bit of my time trying to work out what I feel God's saying to us in the midst of these very challenging and difficult moments or days. And I've kept my ears open to others that I respect, whose words I've come to appreciate, and have written down just a few things that I think that God wants to bring to our attention while we really have our lives put on hold for a season of time. The first thing that I know that God is saying to me is to rediscover the importance of rest or Sabbath. Interestingly, God was the first person to rest in the Bible, and he instructed mankind to rest as well. God didn't need to rest, but he knew that we were going to, and he knew that we would need to be able to take that time out to pause and to consider. So when he established a country, he got them resting once a week. That was called Sabbath. And the Sabbath was an opportunity for the nation of Israel to place their trust in the grace and goodness of God, rather than in their own labour and efforts. So each week they would collect manna in the wilderness, and they had to trust that it would last the next day and that they wouldn't be needing to go out and collect any more because they weren't allowed to. And every 7 years they left the ground fallow, they didn't sow or reap, they didn't bring in a harvest, and they had to trust that the previous year they would be able to get extra amount of food, that their harvest would be especially blessed, and that they would be able to glean from the fields whatever extra they needed, and similarly at Jubilee. So rest and Sabbath is a transfer of our trust back to God and a relinquishing of our right to try and work things out for ourselves through our own strengths, efforts and endeavour. The second thing that I think that God is speaking to me about is that we need to reflect. Many times in the Old Testament, especially in establishing the nation of Israel, he instructed them to remember where they came from. Deuteronomy chapter 8, for example, at the end of the chapter, he says, "You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant with you." So we're to remember the things that God has done. And we can, similarly at Gilgal, he instructed them to build a memorial to remember the blessings of God in the desert, in the wilderness, how he had looked after them and cared for them. So we need to call to mind God's works, and in that reflection, in that remembering, to bring back to our memory things that God has given to us in our own personal lives. This helps turn our eyes off and our attention away from the idols of this world and place them back onto the place of provision and blessing, which is our Father. So we need to take a closer look in times of reflection, looking at where our hearts have strayed, looking at where our thoughts maybe have led us in the wrong direction. And that will then lead us to a third R, if you like, an opportunity to reframe or reset the priorities and the agendas that we believe God has given to us. To take a closer look, which will then lead us to realizing what God is doing, what he is judging, what he is sifting, what he is shaking. And there are three things really that I've put down here very briefly in closing, that God is very, very clearly shaking, and he wants our hearts to be freed from the tyranny of them, from the concern of them, and to turn those things back over into the hands of God. The first thing that he's shaking is the economy of the world. Now, with 22 million Americans applying for unemployment benefit, we're heading into the territory not seen since the 1930s. So God is shaking our economic capacity to earn, and in many cases people have lost their jobs and are now going to have to really start from scratch. But I have found that in my experience and with my friends and my colleagues, that God is providing a place of blessing, a shield of extra provision for many that I know, and we need to turn our focus and our attention to him. Secondly, it's shaking people's health and their own personal capacity to build that security and to make their life stable and and stable for the future. So He's wanting us to place our confidence and our trust in Him again, rather than to looking to national health or to our own resources, because in the current situation they're clearly quite powerless. And then finally, He's shaking mighty nations. It's mainly the nations of the West thus far that have been impacted by this virus, by the Corona-19 and the coronavirus. And God wants us to recognize that He is shaking the heavens. He's shaking mighty nations, so that our hope is built on a future kingdom coming, breaking into the earth in the present, rather than just on the stability and the peace that mankind have been able to create for themselves. And so those are just my thoughts for this morning, and I trust that that is an encouragement to you. Thanks very much.